So testing, 1, 2, testing. Hello, testing, 1, 2, testing, 1, 2.
Hi, can I have your attention for a minute, please, before the debate starts? Yeah, a missing phone. If anyone or just, if you're around, just look around. If you find a Motorola G black phone misplaced in the next 5 minutes, I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Hello, 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'm just testing the microphone so you have to hear my voice for a couple of seconds to make sure it doesn't break up again. All right, it's working. Cool, thanks. I don't know how to sing now. People will go deaf if I do. Debaters, time's up if you're
I welcome everyone to the grand finals of Asian British Parliamentary 2015. Congratulations to all of the teams that have made it this far. On opening government, we have University of Technology Mara 1. Speaking from Mara, we have Jay, referred pronounced Shirde, and Mizra, referred pronounced Ode. On opening opposition, we have International Islamic University of Malaysia. With Mubarak Sadiq representing, both prefer he or they. In team closing government, we have National University of Singapore 3. Brian and Andre both he or they. Closing the debate, closing opposition, we have Nanyang Technological University. Kaisha and Yashi both he or they. Judging this debate alongside myself, we have Samuel Chan from Chinese University of Hong Kong, Julian Ingram from University of New South Wales, Sharada Srinivasan from National Law School of India University, Mr. Joshua Park, Solvent International School of Business, Adriana Castaño de La Salle University, Shannon Chan, Beijing Foreign Studies University, Jay Bustos, University of Philippines, Los Cañas, and Nikhil Kupala from Monash University. And finally, myself, Kalasha from Institute of Business Administration, University of Dhaka. Keeping time for this round, we have Arsh from ABP. He's at the front of this table, and debaters can refer to him for the time so needed. Before we start, I'd like to ask all of the audience to be mindful of the fact that a debate is going on, so to keep their enthusiasm in check, and only have clap or make noise between speeches, and preferably not during speeches. There are 2 mics on each bench. Be rational when using the mics and help each other out when raising your eyes and stuff like that. Also remember, this debate is being live streamed. If anyone has an objection to that, if any of the speakers have an objection to that, it would be nice to point it out now. So, without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister. Okay, wait. So, without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to open proceedings. Here.
No? Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of behaviors in actuality are not harmful, but being harmful or irregular just because society has not grown enough to recognize it as an acceptable behavior. There's nothing wrong with being a homosexual, but many years ago, it was deemed a mental illness because people found it irregular and not normal, and people didn't know how to deal with it. We need a culture of classifying every single behavioral pattern that's irregular, that's somehow not extremely conducive, as a behavior that needs to be cured, as a behavior that, as an illness, is extremely harmful and regressive upon the identity of many individuals. We're very happy to oppose. First, I'll talk about 3 things in this debate. Firstly, how this harms the identity formation and self-worth of an individual. Secondly, how it harms discourse on the identity formation as well as the social acceptance. And lastly, I'll talk about how it creates a perverse stigma. But firstly, let's first talk about why there is an increase in this culture. We think this culture fundamentally first stems from pharmaceutical companies preying on the public and the fear and encourages this culture of self-medicalization. Every flaw in yourself, from physical to flaws within your personality, are things that pharmaceutical companies feel and encourage you to fix rather than accept, rather than understand, or rather than urge society to understand its different behavioral patterns. We think that all this stems from profit incentive, things that are extremely pervasive in society. We think it's extremely bad. No, thank you. Secondly, we also say that there are a confusing pool of information. A lot of people are fearful, and this culture is also created by the same pharmaceutical company that also classifies medical behavioral conditions. This fear-like culture stems from this particular need of ours to overclassify your behavioral pattern, and this culture then perpetuates and drives this same overclassification of behavioral patterns that then becomes extremely pervasive and creates a never-ending cycle of this pervasive culture. Second, let's talk about the identity formation and self-worth of an individual. We think that just because someone is over-energetic, don't mean you immediately categorize this individual as having an attention disorder, and the next thing you do is to sedate him. We think that the reaction should have been to either give him different type of attention or either allow society to create different form of adaptation towards that person's personality. Just because you're over hyperactive doesn't mean that it's a flaw in your personality. That also means we can explore the different ways in which we approach you and the different ways in which society should approach them. We think this is more important than immediately sedating this individual and making sure that he conforms to the rest of society. Secondly, we also think that this creates a society that's largely predisposed to judge everything that deviates from normal. That means that anything that's not normal or anything that seems slightly different would be immediately judged as something that's wrong or a medical illness that we immediately need to fix. I think that's extremely problematic. We also think that the medical label has a lot of legitimacy in order to force and coerce an individual to feel ill and dissatisfied with himself. Because many years ago, many people consented to therapy for homosexuals because they genuinely believed that they were medically ill, sick, and not normal. The medically ill label that's attached to homosexuality many years ago actually made this individual believe that they were sick. We think that also leads to my second point about how it harms discourse. Because individuals who feel that they are sick and feel that their position in society is illegitimate are unlikely to come up and speak about their condition and talk about it in a positive manner. That means that an individual who goes through plastic surgery multiple times might feel that she has body dysmorphia as opposed to legitimately believing that it's a right of herself and part of her personality that she wants and chooses to change the way she looks, and it's the right thing to do. Before that, closing.
Ma'am, are you saying that behavioral irregularities such as bulimia, depression, etc., which are supremely harmful, are not forms of illness that should be treated?
No, we don't think so. We think that there are classifications and differentiations between over-classified behavioral patterns and behavioral patterns that are actually dangerous. For instance, we think behavioral patterns that are dangerous are, for example, suicidal tendencies and self-harm tendencies that are extremely and objectively dangerous. What are not dangerous are, for example, obsession with celebrity or obsession in the internet cannot be immediately classified as an obsessive-compulsive disorder that immediately needs to be fixed, rather than understanding that obsession comes from genuine feeling from your personality. That's something that's good. We think that that differentiation needs to be acknowledged by side opposition. We also think that what happens is that it creates a stigma within society as well as towards that particular individual. The moment they feel that their choices are illegitimate, that's the way in which society treats them as well. Society are very predisposed to immediately reacting towards things like medically ill, towards things that the scientific community feel. This gives a huge amount of traction towards people who feel against those choices. Those choices, even though they're legitimate choices, might be impeached upon by society. Individuals who go out every day making choices that are legitimate, having behaviors that are slightly not normal, but in life and be stigmatized for the things that they do. We think that leads to harder social acceptance for every single of this individual. From individuals who legitimately want to choose to have plastic surgery, from individuals who believe that spending a lot of time using the internet is a legitimate lifestyle that he should be able to live. All these individuals feel that society should accept their way of life and shouldn't impose upon the way in which they live. And we think that's hard to do the moment society immediately brands them as individuals that are mentally ill. The comparative that they have to make on their side is to tell us that this culture of over-classifying doesn't actually lead to the heart of the stigma and the heart that it's hard for individuals to internalize their own personality. We think that society should adapt and should learn to react and accommodate the different personalities you have, rather than immediately move towards curing that particular personality. We think that the immediate need to cure personality is extremely dangerous. Right now, what we need to understand is that all of us have different personalities and a lot of behavior patterns that some people might deem irregular. But if your first reaction is always to cure it because the larger society and because the medical community tells you that you need to cure it, you'll never be able to explore and understand what that personality or behavior pattern means. You're extremely proud to propose.
The House recognizes Jason for a speech, and now I invite the Leader of the Opposition to make opening remarks.
Can you guys hear me? I had a friend who once told me that, like, he seemed very emotionally stable and everything. The problem is that sometimes, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he would randomly start crying because he got jealous that his friends were hanging out with each other. Everyone thought this was weird until someone identified that he was having schizophrenic episodes. And this led to a situation where he was able to go ahead and get help. To this day, he's able to go ahead and have a functioning life because of the help that has been created as a result of classification of that behavioral pattern that he had. A few things that I want to talk about. First, I want to deal with this idea of like big pharmaceutical companies doing evil things. Second, I'll talk about the treatment of these illnesses and how we are the ones who best deal with it. Third, I'll talk about the stigma that is attached to mentally challenged individuals and why we think we are the ones who best cater to them. But before that, first, characterization. We will argue it's a disingenuous characterization to say that the vast majority of people are just really scared of any kinds of differences that happen. In fact, we would argue the vast majority of people are very dismissive and unwilling to go ahead and seek for help because these are individuals who see any kinds of like weird behavior as just that, right? Weird behavior that can be like corrected within your children with a tight slap. That's the reality we live in, where seeking help isn't something that people regularly do and often don't deem it as necessary because it's just another like minor behavioral thing that will just like correct itself with age or it's that person's fault. We'll argue that the actual reality, when the vast majority of people don't consider psychiatrists as people who can help anyone more than the extremely mentally challenged. Would also argue this, right? They would say that, oh, that these people are like just not seen as normal and that kind of thing, right? Unfortunately, a lot of these individuals often lose control of what they want to do, right? It's not like often these individuals often sometimes even don't remember what kind of episodes they had as a result of this, right? These are individuals who often regret the kinds of actions they did and wish they hadn't, and really think that I wouldn't have gotten angry at that point in time if I was being myself. We wouldn't, even if you think that is normal behavior, it is not the choice of that person to go ahead and have that behavior to begin with. We think that necessarily means that this person has a problem, right? So first, this guy say, guys, like the big pharmaceutical companies are screwing us over because they did so in 1950s when they called homosexuality disease, right? A, times have changed. But B, the point is that when you talk about medical communities, it's no longer like just one country, right? It's humongous amounts of media pressure, incredible amounts of experts from all over the globe who go ahead and question each other in this increasingly globalized world. B, we tell you that also, when it comes to these things, right, we have things such as the FDA, which on average takes 12 years for you to be able to pass a freaking drug, because that is the amount of efficacy you have to prove before you can pass anything. Third, we will argue that the point at which you have to do this, you have to publish multiple amounts of academic papers in which you go ahead through your peers, which is like very separate from the big pharma industry, right? And prove to your peers that you're actually proving something, and go through and pass that process where other people question what you were saying. Even if it was under the control of big pharmaceutical companies, the point at which they go ahead and have paid classifications and they risk a huge fortune, ladies and gentlemen, if they can be delegitimized and can be made fun of by other experts because they classify something wrongly, because their entire credibility lies on that, and they rely on their credibility to sell drugs to begin with, not just that particular drug, but all other drugs and other diseases they provide as well.
Sure, even with the statistical advantage you get from all these research, there is no one definite cure for any psychological disorder they decide. If you don't have a definite cure, why does the individual have to lose their autonomy to decide their treatment? Because now the doctor is the cure that they must accede to.
There are a lot of things that you can do, right? Look, A, sometimes people in the long run can cure themselves. But B, I fail to see why an immediate cure is the only thing you have to consider when you're able to control your behavior to a large extent with continuous medication. We think that's a solution compared to what you would have had. And this brings me on. So how do we exactly treat these kinds of situations, right? Look, their comparative is these people are now called weird and whatnot, right? A, these people would be called weird by society regardless. So what would happen the point at which you don't do something that conforms to society? The point is, either you as an individual feel weird and therefore you take actions by yourself to correct those things without ever knowing what it is that you need to do. Or B, often things such as parents, you think like, I must do something in order to correct my child. And often that involves really punitive things such as like grounding them because you get angry at them all the time, and you think that will work. The alternative is, we have actual experts coming in, studying these behavioral patterns and telling us how exactly to deal with this. Parents can then also and it's a mutual thing on the model where parents also then talk to these experts to be able to deal with the situation when they come back home and deal with their child. I also had a friend whose brother is suffering from depression, but his parents was really angry because they said, oh, I'll just slap him, that'll show him his depression. But he talked to an actual expert. That expert told him, you have to be nice to him because otherwise that will get worse. And that is how we go ahead and solve that problem a lot better as well. But secondly, right, we would argue that a lot of these behavioral patterns, even if they argue, are overanalyzed, such as like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. A lot of these things are often precursors to often bigger mental problems that these people may have. So for instance, schizophrenia can often be a precursor to long-term depression for a lot of individuals. The point at which you have early identification means that these individuals can study those patterns and deal with it before, when they seek help before to begin with. So we would argue that you're able to prevent a lot of often bigger mental harms as a result of classifying a lot of minor behaviors that happens as a result. Finally, in terms of the stigma, right? These guys never actually solve the problem of of the stigma that is attached to mentally challenged people. We are the ones who are able to, for the first time, say that there are spectrums that exist. A lot of people can have mental conditions, and it is not something that is so rare that you have to treat as something weird. The point at which a lot of people, your child, your neighbor, even you yourself can have these conditions means the stigma slowly attached to someone being mentally challenged, slowly but surely is reduced. And that also means the inertia to looking and seeking help also to a certain extent goes observer means you understand that the problem you have is not necessarily an extreme problem, but that it can be that a lot of other people can have these kinds of problems as well. So in the long run, you would argue that eventually this leads to a humongous amount of help for individuals who suffer from a lot of these kinds of mental conditions. You must oppose.
Before you start, at the end of the speech, please move the mic to the other line because there's only one on the Yeah. So without further ado, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister Megzal to make his speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would agree that every single person in this room is screwed up in one way or another. But fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, what we have to agree on is that some things are objectively harmful towards individuals, while some other things may be deviations from accepted social behavior today that might be acceptable social behavior tomorrow. For them to say and generalize just because everyone might feel weird today, and that might mean it's easier for you to talk about something tomorrow, ignores the fact that sometimes people face crippling, harmful, self-indulging behavior, ladies and gentlemen, while others are forced into believing that they have such harmful behavior when they actually don't. That's the distinction that the opening opposition does not make in this debate. We think the medicalizing as well as the paternal nature of the opening opposition is a self-fulfilling prophecy where individuals who are mildly schizophrenic now are pushed into depression, into the bipolar, depressionary stage that they want to prevent to begin with. We agree that sometimes it may be a precursor, we may be able to detect that, we can have a conversation about that, but not when we label them as ill, disease, and wrong in society, even when it's not that severe. We think that's harmful. I'll respond in several ways. Firstly, how do we help people who genuinely need help? Firstly, we already told you in Jasmine's speech that these are individuals that are willing to help already because there are broad categorizations, for example, objective standards of harm that we're willing to medicalize on. Notice that the start or the advent of massive radicalization, ladies and gentlemen, only began at the advent of the internet, as well as the advent of social media being pervasive in everyday life, that allowed for pharmaceutical companies to be able to increase the pervasiveness of classification before. When previously, ladies and gentlemen, we were able to make simple but also categorized easily, ladies and gentlemen, objective harms for individuals. The friend that Mubarak talked about, secondly, ladies and gentlemen, is also very important. Because that individual would only have been able to speak out about their problems and categorize their problems in a system, like he said, that is willing to speak about his problems. But in a system, ladies and gentlemen, where they are not so forgiving, the parent is looking and making sure that this person is diseased, to make sure that they can fix that person, or a society that otherizes a person that's ill, you won't have that conversation because the starting point is through a wall of prejudice that this person is sick, and therefore anything that this person says at best will be seen with the lens of condescension, or at worst, ladies and gentlemen, see with the lens of fear. That means that anything this person says in that particular point in time is illegitimate under that side of the house. That's why this person is less able to seek help. Compared to what we told you, ladies and gentlemen, where you don't prima facie categorize these individuals as being ill, it is more likely than not these individuals will say that I'm willing to talk about this because I won't face the potential of being drugged by my parents, having Ritalin shoved down my throat every night, ladies and gentlemen, to make sure that I'm not hyperactive or my behavior is acceptable for tomorrow's party, apparently. And that's what we think is exceptionally important. But secondly, we'll go even further. They told us that most of these people feel relief because these people are out of control. We would posit that sometimes this relief is constructed in of itself, ladies and gentlemen, because society places the bar of what is acceptable behavior, and once you achieve the acceptable bar, then you feel relief. But nowhere else in between, or nowhere else which is what you are born with or who you are as a person. We have to engage with the fact that sometimes relief in of itself is a socially constructed behavior, and the goalpost that's set by majoritarian states in Germany, and it's illegitimate at times. We think that's exceptionally important. Sit down. The second area, so the first clash was debate in terms of helping people who genuinely help. We think we genuinely help individuals to speak out in that particular circumstance because you don't otherwise that in a view of condescension or fear through a wall of prejudice first. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, in regards to medicalization, the glib response that came from Mubarak is that some just a fact file, a preset case about why you might have some regulations when it comes to FDA, ignoring reality, ladies and gentlemen, where pharmaceutical companies have massive lobbying power, fraud regulations all the time, and even if they're held accountable, have private settlements that can pay off all the time, ladies and gentlemen, and are silent in nature. This is undeniably happening every single day of our lives. Today, that GlaxoSmithKline paid off 17 settlements in 2015 alone in making sure that that particular case does not happen. It's something that you can't just say that regulations exist and say that in reality they actually work. Is very different thing. But they also did not engage the fact that people have to deal with a glut of information. It's okay if someone can perfectly identify that this category perfectly identifies my disease in some circumstances. Let's take that best case scenario. But most of the time, people misidentify their categories as well, ladies and gentlemen. Because of the glut of categories and information, they look online and misidentify that particular information. That only happens in a world where you don't have a conversation first before you jump towards medicalization and categorizing individuals on that side of the house. We think that's exceptionally important. Before I go further, I'll give opening chance.
Look, recognize that sometimes people need medical help. Why would they seek that help if the medical community doesn't even recognize that as a problem?
They will seek help at the point at which they feel uncomfortable with the way that they feel about themselves. Because if they don't feel uncomfortable with the way that they're acting, then they shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable with how they're acting, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you need to respond to that. The last area of clash I want to talk about is that will this individual be called weird regardless into the future, and how do we move forward? We think Mubarak implied victim blaming of the worst kind. That apparently in this particular circumstance, if you have OCD behavior, like many of my friends in Mara, ladies and gentlemen, that you would be a person that needs to fix yourself for society, because it's very hard for society to fix their own perceptions in regards to what is acceptable behavior. We think that's unacceptable behavior on that side. Because look at the tone of Mubarak's speech, that it is just impossible to change society's minds. But apparently, ladies and gentlemen, we've changed our minds about societal acceptable behavior all the time in many circumstances. Sure, we may think that it's hard to change people's minds, but it's easier to change people's minds when you don't have a medical community confirming to them, ladies and gentlemen, the prejudice that pre-exists in everyone's mind. People are very quick to otherize minority groups. That only happens when you have a legitimate body that has no other work to do but to categorize people in smaller and smaller categories, dividing them even further so we can otherize people to infinity. Ladies and gentlemen, we would rather live in a world where individuals are deemed normal even though they deviate from the norm. We think that helps you and helps me. Thank you.
Malaysia, Malaysia. Malaysia, weh.
we need to nuance this debate. This debate happens in a spectrum. Obviously, we're not defending the classification of homosexuality as something which is a psychological illness. At the same time, we will see that it is perfectly legitimate for the government to not be forced to defend like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But in that world, ladies and gentlemen, especially in the 21st century, where our ability to medically ascertain what's right and wrong has been confirmed or is continuously being improved, in a world in which it is much better for us to err aside of caution by diagnosing that person or treating that person, and in the future, even if the medical community has been proven to be wrong, we can retract that treatment in comparison to a world in which we do not treat these individuals, we simply ignore this problem and force those individuals to see themselves as individuals who are problematic, but the community is not there for me, the medical community will not be there to provide treatment for me whatsoever. We say the conclusion to this debate is that even if we will misdiagnose some individuals, we think it is much better, ladies and gentlemen, to err aside caution by not providing anything whatsoever. So, 3 questions. No. First question, when does medical classification actually take place? Myth told you that the big pharma dominates politics through private settlements and regulatory capture. 2 responses. 1. Even if big pharma is strong, Mubarak told you there are a myriad of other corporate entities who will countervail the interests of big pharma to begin with. I know that's insufficient. I'm going to go even further. Besides that, even if you look at money, FDA alone takes 12 years for you to pass it, which means that no matter how much money you throw upon FDA, time will not be on your side. But more importantly, there are a lot of professors and scientists, ladies and gentlemen, who are independent from these corporations who can easily push for intellectual critique which is independent of monetary interest. But even if you do not buy that logic, big pharmaceutical companies have a disincentive, ladies and gentlemen, to be sued, even as you rightly pointed out in terms of private settlements. Let's acknowledge this. In the 1960s, when homosexuality was seen to be psychological illness, why didn't you see AstraZeneca and Pfizer pushing for treatments upon those individuals? Because they realized it was wrong. They realized if they were to give up treatments, ladies and gentlemen, they would lose massive profits when their lives were proven in the future. That means there's already a business disincentive for false classification to begin with. The conclusion here, ladies and gentlemen, is that a lot of these corporations are risk averse because the massive check to check this, but even if those separate checks do not work, those business checks still exist. No. Second question is debate on individual unhappiness. I think site opening government misses the comparison. They say, oh, but this is just a self-construction because you see yourself as someone who's different than the others. Even without medical confirmation, if you are a person diagnosed with bipolar disorder, you will realize that you are different. If you are a person who's extremely energetic and you run around the room for like 10 hours, even without your parents saying that there's something wrong with you, you will realize that you are different. But why is the comparative flowers? When I realize that I'm different and the medical community is doing nothing, I'm more likely to self-diagnose myself. And that's far worse because self-diagnosis often is not backed up by any medical certification, by any form of medical truth to it. To the point I feel a sense of helplessness. I'm more likely to blame it upon myself. What's the comparison here? The comparison in our world is that the medical community can at least mitigate some of the hardships, or at least it's more classified in comparison to individual treatment, which you are more likely to give to your side. No. Then they say, let's look at a comparison on discourse. They say it's much harder for discourse to happen when you label this individual to be ill. I acknowledge that at the beginning it will be difficult. That's why Mubarak told you, the point in which we set up a spectrum, the point in which individual will realize that psychological illness is an exclusive material but can actually be inflicted on any one of us in this room, we can reduce that stigma. I agree, it will not happen in 1 or 2 weeks, it will take a long time. But comparatively, we change it a lot further because it impacts every single one of us. None of us, ladies and gentlemen, are free from this. But the comparative, how the hell are conversations going to happen in your world when you yourself see that this is not a problem? We should just ignore it. Why should I talk about it when you yourself mention that parents should just treat this as something that's normal? Conversations are less likely to happen in your world when I'm to
complain there's something wrong with me. Like why is my behavioral pattern so weird? And then my friend say, dude, I think like seriously, I think you're just crazy, like you need to deal with yourself. Conversations are less likely to happen, ladies and gentlemen, comparatively in their side. No. Finally, on societal judgment, there are two things we want to point out here. One is the context in which this debate takes place. The context is not a world in which everyone is seeking help. It's actually the reverse context in which a lot of people are ignoring help. The context is what I told you, which just like ignore. They say, guys, don't worry. Society should just adapt to these individuals. How does that actually look in real life in society then? That's when parents are more likely to take their own actions, ladies and gentlemen, to misdiagnosing by confining these individuals. When Miss told you, oh, no, they just dropped their kids. That's exactly what happened. When I don't think it's a bipolar disorder, like, oh, maybe my kids are high fever. That's like, give like $500 to those kids. Misdiagnosis is far worse. Miss.
You're saying that individuals that experience objective harm may be harmed, but you're not balancing that harm against the massive number of individuals who may not feel there's anything wrong with their behavior, but it's imposed by society to shape their own behavior.
I just told you the comparative. If you are an extremely energetic person, you can see by your own, even without societal inspection. When you see on your own, it's much better for you to have someone like a medical practitioner to talk to, or at least some more medical certification if that's right or wrong, in comparison to self-diagnosis. But let's go even if that is the case, ladies and gentlemen, it is much better if you are risk-averse. I give the best case scenario. If you earn the side of caution, ladies and gentlemen, it is much better because even if you have to misdiagnose the person, you can pool the treatment in the future, or you can discuss about it in the future. But if you do not diagnose that person at all, that person might be trigger-friendly. That thing might be a precursor to severe depression. The person might commit suicide. The person might have already died. The point is, our harms are irreversible. Your harms, ladies and gentlemen, can be retracted in the future. It is much better for the medical community to be risk-averse in comparison to risk-friendly. I do acknowledge that some misdiagnosis might happen, but in this world and in this context, it's much harder for that to happen. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, it is much better for the medical community to play a role in comparison to parents or that individual taking up his own action. I oppose.
Now that you've heard the Malaysian version of medical breakthroughs, maybe it's time to hear what the Singaporeans say. Right now, I remember 20 more advances. We claim, economic government, the ability for the majority mainstream lifestyles individuals to further oppression when they're able to hide behind medical legitimacy is conditions. That individuals should not be able to use this as a tool to further their lifestyle just because someone is different. And we show you how classification as a tool itself is going to fundamentally break up minority groups with such different and detailed lifestyle and undermine their ability to have activists who further those ideals that they think are meaningful and important for themselves. But before that, several responses. First, let's look at this whole idea of whether or not parents are going to go crazy when you actually have a condition that ought to be cured. Right? First, we could test the idea that a majority of medical conditions are in need of medical attention, right? Why? Because sometimes when you have problems of depression, or so they classify, that you're upset, that a doctor may not be the best person that you need to approach to, right? That sometimes it's about the closure and the love that you get from your family, that you get the best cure for that. And oftentimes if you break up, maybe approaching your ex-boyfriend is probably the best way to do so, and you don't need to go to your parents, right? Or to go to the doctors. But the idea here is, what about parents who are just overly attentive and just want to give you the best cure? Therefore, they'll just take out like a bottle of paracetamol and shut down your throat. Hopefully, you get out of depression.
But we say that's unlikely, right? One, because their access to medical facilities and pills like steroids, like things that could actually change your biological construct, are things that are not allowed by the state, that you actually need to get legal approval to get those things. And at the point where your barrier of entry is the doctor itself, one, there's immediate consultation to that doctor, and two, and it has to be directed to a specific symptom, or else you will not be able to get them. But more than that, oftentimes when parents take up actions to psychologically tailor extra love to their child, those things are corrected, right? Even if they were wrong, oftentimes you can grow up and move on from that, right? Versus something that has a biological changes in our body because you take those pills and your brain goes wonky when it's the wrong pill that goes down your body. So thank you. But it's no idea about, oh wait, but really it's a medical problem. And we say, well, it's not really a medical problem if you don't have a X drug for a Y illness. A lot of times, a lot of our psychological classification for problems do not have an immediate solution to every single individual because it's often personalized, right? The individual, it's not like taking paracetamol for fever. It's not always the same cure for the same disease. At the point where the medical society cannot definitely tell you that you must take this in order to get better, they don't have an authority to tell you how to treat yourself. But also, we stop the ability for this individual to approach other sources and there being best means to approach them, right? Like if I have a sexual addiction problem, I see it as the doctor being able to solve my problem for me. But maybe really looking at people like Brian and Lipsa who possibly give me the solutions of how to fix this thing. But if I don't think they're authorized to be able to deal that for me, I will never find that as possible solutions of my problem. But more than that, oftentimes the greatest form of depression and psychological illnesses comes from the fact that you think that you have a condition that's unacceptable. So even when I'm not ill, you make me ill because you make me feel that I ought to be rejected, that I have something that ought to be changed within me. And if I think that I still want that really, that's going to keep me trapped in my own identity, that I will hate myself. That's probably the source of even more problems, right? No, thank you. Right, but we also think that the ability for an individual to disassociate a blanket condition to direct it only to symptoms is important. That I can treat like shaking hands, but I don't have to treat my whole fervor for wanting to read a lot of books in a day, right? Oftentimes these are not big conditions that need to be fixed at all. But oftentimes you think that when you have a community that have the same issues that you do, these communities are best able to advise you how to go about living that same lifestyle but fixing the negative and harmful aspects of it. What do I mean by that? If I keep liking to go for plastic surgery, people within my community can tell me, hey, don't take on this procedure because that is harmful. Don't starve yourself because that's harmful. But I'm also going to be able to tell you that maybe we can keep going to surgeries together when you're all safe, right? The ability to use their advice versus not harming yourself is important when you have that life community to be able to support those ideas that you can still carry on for. So we also think that it's important not to allow these individuals to have the reliance on statistical norms that big pharmaceuticals have, because oftentimes you don't have an ability to check pharmaceutical firms because there's no track record of how your brain frequency works. And last I checked, we don't have complete knowledge of how the brain functions. Therefore, we're not able to check if there was ever a problem, right? At the point where you're able to give me a medicine that stops my brain function and somehow makes me feel better, I can never tell the pharma company that you were wrong and therefore not be able to check that. Extension. We think there's going to be oppression in 3 ways. First is because you actively reduce the number of people that are suffering or that are experiencing the same conditions. Right, why? Because when you have pills that take you away from that symptom, that takes you away from the same lifestyle, you don't have people that have the same experience to be able to rally enough traction to say that is a potential lifestyle that we all want to lead. That means you won't have a demand for social structures that facilitate those lifestyles. For example, the need for sex change or racial color changes. All those things require a lot of people to think that they want it and not to have to fix their mind and reject those procedures. That means a lot more people are then able to be gaining access to this infrastructure that's important for them. Closing.
Sir, are you okay with such trends as extreme dieting, vomiting up your food, and inserting of
So the point that Lisa clarified is that the point when you start killing yourself or killing somebody, then that's a medical problem, right? Because it's not your body. But the point where it's OCD, then no one's going to fix it, right? That's second reason, right? You give the ability for culture and religion to use the absolutism within medicine to bore the ability and entrench their roots of power so that they can be certain that their discrimination runs true. That's how homosexuality works. Because my ability to tell you that homosexuality is something to be cured, that even psychology supports that, means that you have no way and meaningful way to challenge that, something that's grounded in statistics, exactly what opening opposition says. But the last thing is also the ability for activist groups to be able to further this identity because they don't have the expertise to challenge it. Oftentimes, these are not the people who are your researchers or your biomedical scientists who don't understand how genetics work to be able to challenge whatever statistical norms that these people already have gone through. That means to say, even if I think that homosexuality is a legitimate lifestyle because I think it's free choice, there is no way I'm able to challenge that and tell people this is something that we can stand for. At a point we are able to marginalize and demonize a certain community because they're different from you. Classification gives you that mechanism to hurt them even more, and on the side of the government, we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Whenever he's done setting up the flag, I invite opposition member to make his speech. Also, strongly urge the members, if they're going to make a chat, make it more interesting than just repeating a university name over and over
Can everyone hear me? Is this good? There's a line, they tell us, between when these behaviors are bad and medically dangerous, and before that, when we shouldn't really care about them. I also have a friend, or should I say, I had a friend of mine in high school, who we all thought was totally depressed, never actually went for a diagnosis of a condition, seemed to muddle through life fine enough with photos of her holidays on Instagram, chat about her boyfriend, and things like that. Very recently, out of the blue, she committed suicide. Nothing they say will bring her back. It's too late to wait, Mr. Speaker, because by then, the low-level behaviors that form patterns that lead people to one night choose to end their own life have already taken their toll. I want to first deal with this idea that we still, in this day and age, are going to diagnose deviance as pathology. Because this is the idea we get from both opening and closing government. We're told bad lifestyle choices, like homosexuality apparently, are going to be the sort of things that we diagnose. Literally, this no longer happens. As if there is no progressive check against this sort of bad pathologization, which makes me believe that this probably will not occur. But more importantly, right, like I'm literally agnostic about whether you want to have sex change operations or not, because there's no room for anyone to say that more people having sex change operations or less people having sex change operations is objectively a good or bad thing, because if you do not through your mechanism merely of not labeling these things as mental illnesses, create some sort of massive social consciousness about these things. And I suggest that things you ought to do in the interim is allow people to be happy and live a life that they can find meaningful. That's why we don't think these pathologies will be categorized in the first place, but even if they were, people are happy to give them the support they need. Some rebuttal before I go on to 3 points of extension, both vertically and horizontally, extending from that of opening opposition. No. Okay. We're told from closing that these things aren't personalized. You can't trace the drug in a one-to-one scenario. So it's not actually a real illness. Literally bizarre. Personalized treatments are literally the next thing in modern medicine, where you literally are able to match one treatment to an individual. But also it's like saying that obscure diseases are not real diseases, because you can't actually know if that person is ill or not. But more importantly, science is against their side. I'm actually going to go into this in my extension and tell you how there are exact chemical cures for what is going on in your brains, because we're all back to me at the end of the day. Lastly, even on this, the principle of falsifiability in science suggests that in modern medicine, if something doesn't work for a long time, it'll probably be phased out and replaced with something that does work. So I think this gives us to suggest that these cures all fail. Okay, opening tells us big pharma is a danger and we ought to respect and fear them. I think this is like saying that all drugs are bad. Because to the extent that all drugs are manufactured by big pharma, they all have the same incentives, right? Like in all these scenarios, we recognize that we're willing to make a trade-off, letting them reap profit off our illnesses. Yes, so that people can get the cures they need. That's important. Then lastly, tell us this relief is fake and socially constructed. Yeah, but that's fine, because you still get the relief, and literally it's no mechanism with which to approach it. If the placebo treatment is effective, Mr. Speaker, then it's something that I'm probably willing to live with. 3 extensions into this debate. A lot of this addresses the stuff coming out of GOV anyway. First, I'll give you the real reason how classification and knowledge helps individuals. No. Secondly, I'll talk about chemical cures and why they're actually a thing. Lastly, I'll talk about stigma and why we solve that better on our side. Okay, first on classification and knowledge. I think what opening proposition tells you is there are small, low-level psychological behaviors that are the precursors to more serious psychological illnesses. That is true. But also, there are some times where you are sick, where there are many cases when low-level behaviors which are usually seen as ill adjustments, i.e. literally the things we're discussing in motion, things like skipping class, things like inability to get out of bed, things like a utter unwillingness to, utter avoidance of social contact, are the signs and symptoms of something very, very serious. What do we get when we actually get to classify these things? I think firstly, we get the resources of science to actually be able to collate, portray, and identify these things in a way that people can understand and interpret. That's really crucial, because what that does is that it allows us to access deep information, about the structural issues that actually underlie these things. So when more doctors are involved, like trying to source for information about bulimia, that is a benefit, because we now understand that condition better than we did. In a way that's really important, because no one really listens to sociologists. They're much more likely to listen to medical professionals to get more power behind that fight. But before I go on, closing.
If you classify an individual to have a mental illness, anything that individual says is deemed to be irrational and never gaining legitimacy and traction within society. How are you going to cater to his needs?
Got that. Earlier this morning, I asked about flu. You guys still listen to me when I was debating. The point is, if you change the way we think of mental illness to be any other illness, which you do when you have more things categorized as mental illness, then you get a win on that side. More on that later when I talk about chemical cures. Okay, but the second thing we get in terms of classification and knowledge is this. When you notice that patterns, information, and behaviors that I just talked to you, it's much easier, like things that are now online because doctors know about it. Then you can notice and report these things. Not just as doctors, Mr. Speaker, but also just in terms of accessing support amongst your family, amongst people who care about you. So if they say it's sometimes good for people not to go to the doctor, and we think that's probably untrue, then that better happens on our side, because you're better able to identify when your friend is actually ill. 2, chemical cures. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, and actually we all know this, regardless of whether mental illness is going to be pathologized or not, which is crucial, we're all back to beat in our brains and chemical triggers. Someone with serotonin levels which is artificially low is unable to feel normal human happiness, normal human emotions that you and I all should. Prozac literally modifies serotonin levels in your brain, which allows you to feel these feelings again and be a functioning human being. And throughout the course of this one, I become very sensitive to these things, because people I know are literally on these drugs and I can see the differences in their lives. Okay, what we get when we demystify this notion that somehow there is something weird with our brains and we can't fix our brains in the same way we can fix the rest of the bodies, is that we lose that stigma of mental illness, which is the whole point. And the point where you get a greater consciousness
that this information about the fact that our brains are hackable and fixable and curable with chemicals just like the rest of the body, then you lose that stigma. But the last one, stigma, very briefly, stigma is worse on their side because most stigma stands for looking inward and self-esteem, which means that when you're asked to take agency for your actions, when you're being sad or lazy in the world of hacking people, then you feel worse in the comparative as opposed to when you're able to say, that's not my fault, it was merely the chemicals in my brain. Very proud of those.
It tells you a lot about mental illness. When debaters in extremely public tournaments can use these things to further their need to win debates. And that's exactly the problem that we have here. That to the extent that we understand mental illness, none of us actually understand that it's a condition that requires real help. And sometimes the problem isn't so much that it is with the brain as it is with the fact that we create many illnesses by the way we interact with people, the way we treat them, and the way we understand and empathize with individuals. Sometimes you do question today, what's it not how we treat it, but how we even create these problems in the first place? There are two things we could ask. First, does the classification of behavioral patterns really help as psychological illnesses help the curing of psychological illnesses? And second, how do we really create more inclusive societies? Because we always think that's good. As a starting point in response to hope, the last time we were incredibly averse, and we were on the side of being averse to medical illnesses, we started to lobotomize people that we didn't understand as social difficulties. We started electroshocking people because they seem to act in incredibly different ways. If your condition or your concern was that one or two people unfortunately committed suicide, I'm telling you, very cold-bloodedly perhaps, the end result is that you make a lot of other people's lives considerably punished by just on a broad brush being worse. No thanks. We think, first of all, that we need to understand that the truth is that many of the psychological illnesses start from the point of identification and identifying that much of this has a very social dimension. To the extent that perhaps some individuals may incidentally have these psychological illnesses that reflect behavioral patterns, but there are many ways which this can be solved. Insofar as one reason we told you, that direct harms that classify under psychological illness. Currently, they can be seen help. OG is smart. But the real question, therefore, no thank you, is how do you think, or you create perceptions that there really is a problem as well? OG talked about big pharma having perverse incentives. This is very extended. We think that there are many other people in societies that have many other perverse incentives and many other reasons to use this kind of classification against you. There are three, in fact, and this is the example we gave. First, religious groups and organizations that were happy to pervade their own social behaviors and patterns by exactly involving for these illnesses to be fought and seen as psychological illnesses to collate and monopolize their own social behaviors that we thought was incredibly unfair. Second, employers and workplace elites. And third, and in truth, you and me, individuals on the ground who couldn't accept the differences that people had and conveniently shove the problem away by simply saying this is a psychological illness, while it needs to be dealt with chemicals, that the real problem is that you and me, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that the chemicals in your brain. No thank you. We need to rethink further this, and the point of our accession at Young is really there. The classification, no thank you, many of these things creates the exact perception of the problem. And that is why we fundamentally oppose being able to classify them as psychological illnesses in the first place. Because it's basically the connotation is incredibly bad for three particular reasons. We gave you an extension again with Vaya. First, it reinforces a deep-rooted natural fear that we have of things that we can't understand, that we can't relate, and we can't appreciate or perform the norm that we have. That leads us to completely make these classifications in the first place. Second, the indisputability of the common man viewed scientific fact makes the enormity of that particular pressure so much more the moment you pose this as a psychological illness in the first place. It means I am trapped by that particular thing that's going in my head that I can't tell, I didn't even know my people are telling me that I have. Third, that the true scariest part of it is that all of us have an aversion to psychological conditions in the first place. I mean, the moment you condition it as a psychological illness, that's when you cement the fact that these social patterns are not just social behaviors, but actual real psychological issues and illnesses as a whole. Yes.
How do you break the link about people's fear of the unknown? Get more research on it before we go outside of the house.
And that's where we tell you that sometimes the solution isn't having more research when you think that the problem, when you understand that problem isn't a medical one, but a social one as well. That's why we have our internal thank you for our extension. Our extension would be that social behaviors should not be classified as psychological illnesses because they are not psychological illnesses as a whole. And once you start realizing the range of things that you can say, that range of things that you can do to help these individuals, or either help these individuals or start incorporating assessment of who we are, changes fast. And that was his last point on his extension talking about that many things don't have a correlation to other things when it comes to social behaviors. Sometimes things are perhaps behaviors like shaking hands or whatever, and all these things can be individually dealt with without covering them with the broad brush of saying that they are psychological illnesses as well. And that's a step that we eventually lead ourselves to the more we call these particular behaviors as psychological illnesses as a whole. Look at it. How do we then create better and more inclusive societies? There are 2 points we talk to you in regards to moving this forward. First, we need to reduce the kinds of creatures, social structures that facilitate the ability to accept these lifestyles as a whole. If your question was how do we accept, how do we start understanding social behaviors, then you only start understanding social behaviors by interacting and being forced in these situations, or understanding how these individuals act, and being exactly uncomfortable in situations to understand that they every time behave these particular ways around. But second, you also say that you reduce the interest of people wanting to behave differently in these different situations. And we think that's exactly the problem. A big part sometimes are legitimizing the ideas in their minds, but these are things that they should be having conversations, that we should find medical help with as a whole, and something that the problem really does lie in their heads, but actually they have every legitimate right to be these positions in this edition. Serious extension was clear. First, they said that classification helps the industry, it helps science forward because, well, more research, that's great. We think, and the concept and the caveat that Jan gave was simply that, well, people don't like to listen to socialists. Perhaps the reason why people don't like this socialists is precisely because we don't understand the true significance of what they can do. And a big part of that is completely shocked away when you reduce it exactly to the behaviors of psychological illnesses, where I don't have to care because that's something I don't have. And to the extent that he's willing to say that more people the issue needs more better research, why can't the exact same thing happen on our side with these individuals for concerns as a whole? Next thing he said, chemical cures, like actually helps them guys. Sure, but if that was an issue, a big part of it is to get these individual cures, acid, OG, and inclusive government are already available to you. But what we force to inclusive government is this, that perhaps sometimes the cure isn't chemical. And the only way to succeed that it isn't chemical is stop reducing it to say that it invariably always is. And the more you understand that social behaviors are social behaviors, you retain the classification, you start breaking the ability to accept these things you can deal with and have to deal with in different ways. That's how I'm having goals.
The subject is grand speech. Now I invite Kaisha to make the final speech of the grand final. Here.
Okay?
I too had a friend. He spent a year destroying himself. He lost his friends, partners, debates, teams, listeners. And the difference from us and all the other houses and all the other medical conditions that we want to talk about is that what he did was irregular, but still within what we at that time considered what was normal. Alcoholism, skipping classes, and avoiding social contact. Things that young or been told about. And that is where the debate is. That is where CO kicks in, we want to debate. Where the medicalization of the borderlines is the silent and hidden maladies amongst us, whose effects simply might be just any individual's fault, and may actually be healthy, but as a collective or with certain motivations behind them, become truly destructive, curtailing choices and crushing dreams. We think at large, like government has been highly dismissive of these things, and we would like them to be already just moving on then, I'll be talking to you about three things. Firstly, direct harm to people in treatment. Secondly, choices that lead to stigma. First issue, direct harm to people and treatment. Here's the thing that we have to understand about the decision-making of parents, patients, and healthcare professionals. We are again talking about borderlines. We don't really care about the obviously ill who are sent to the hospital and immediately give them intervention. These are again the only cases where you get chemical lobotomies that side government seems to care so much about. We don't think these so-called extreme and radical treatments such as electroshock therapy and whatnot actually apply to the borderline cases that we want to talk about. But at large then, we think that if what side government wants in terms of self and parents being the first lines of defense, in terms of social support, we think that this already happens because firstly, most people aren't hypochondriacs who self-medicate or demand life-changing medications from doctors needed. But for that matter, we don't know whether doctors and pharmacists would allow them to do that. But secondly, Yang also told you that medicalization is about changing the milieu of public knowledge as well. We told you that people get help better, faster, and less randomly from internet pseudoscience where they go, maybe you should try X, Y, Z drug, because at large, people learn to recognize behavioral patterns that are actually harmful. Because medical knowledge is about the epistemic development towards the point whereby we do recognize and document the science that tells us certain behavioral patterns are actually harmful for you and are things that will curtail your damn choices. And that's why we think at large in our paradigm, people are the ones who get the guilt. We exclusively on psychological opposition told you that we have to get help faster, that we have to develop greater knowledge. Let's move on to the second point in terms of choices. So government essentially says that the choices of deviant individuals in OG and of minority collectives influencing government gives you bad effects. Okay. Firstly, we think that at large, that both cures and that both placebos and chemical cures exist to actually treat and help these people. That at large, very often, choices are curtailed by illnesses that stop you from feeling a certain something, that stop you from feeling the emotions that make you want to do certain things in a good way, that push you towards starving yourself in a way that makes you go below the BMI of 13, something like that. But at large, we tell you that we are the house that actually can provide solutions for these problems that are regular behaviors, but do not at large seem to be obviously harmful at first. More importantly than that, we told you that even if there is no cure for this illness, that getting the classification of an illness means that it is not your own inherent lazy character or social withdrawal or whatever the hell it is. It is the social, it's very simply put, one, not your fault, two, temporary, three, curable and copable with. And that's what will get you the social, familial, and collegial support that helps you cope, even if it is not curable. And if it is curable, it will get cured even faster than help medication. And that's where we take this debate, absolutely. Because we are a paradigm that creates a society that understands and recognizes that disease is something that is temporary. The very fact that America and Scandinavia are known as Rosette nations has reduced the stigma of depression. For the very simple fact that everyone understands that depression is something that is curable, temporary, and gets you the help that you need. And everyone else should be helping you when you have depression. And that's what we told you happens if you medicalize. And society recognizes these things, and society will help you. Before I move on, okay.
The opposition seems to be relying on convenient categorization of things that lead to death, or everything apparently leads to death, ignoring the fact there are a massive number of IIUMs and mental illnesses categorized today that are absolutely inconsequential when it comes to those harms. Why are those limited under your side of the house?
Because when you suffer from depression, you become an alcoholic, lose your English, and generally don't talk to anyone at all. Everything that really destroys your life and it destroys your choices, even if you don't die from it. Moving on, okay. Well, let's address something that psychology government brought to you then. The idea that somehow social harms are more detectable or going to be better cured in their paradigm. We disagree with this. The very simple example that I gave you already that they ignored was the question of bulimia and eating disorders. Things that are endemic, things that are trends that generally stand for very harmful social norms, such as modeling, self-esteem, Facebook, that generally are bad for body images. These are things that, yes, have a social origin, but we ignore their social origins and we ignore the sociologists like me, because at large, we don't think that they are a problem until medical and healthcare professionals tell us that there are massive harms associated with it. That at large, these people are suffering from mental drives that should not exist there, that have social harm, social origin. And that's where we think that also we cure social factors and problems even better. The debate is about identifying the symptoms and signs and behaviors that are disorders, that are medical problems, and that's what, again, we think we win in terms of ensuring choices. Let's then move on to the final points of stigma. I've already covered 3 reasons why stigma goes down, but let's move on to the point that closing government again wants to bring on. We think OG has already largely died in terms of their problem solution mismatch with regard to the question of big pharmaceutical companies manipulating business views. But the thing that secular government tells you that is that social majorities use statistics to discriminate against people. The unfortunate point is that we think that it made a very severe epistemic problem in this state, because we already told you that science progresses and evolves. That generally speaking, statistics aid in reducing discrimination. That statistics are how we figure out whether or not something is harmful, or the degree to which it is harmful, and therefore what? Whether or not it's okay to be gay, or 2, whether or not it's okay to be puking out every single meal. And that's why, again, we think we are the ones who better identify, because medicalization is about the treatment, the diagnosis, and the detection of disorders, and the rejection of those ones that are not. For all these reasons, who is CEO?
Thank all the debaters for a fantastic debate. The adjudicators will now retire for deliberation. Everyone else enjoy your dinner.
All right.